Time for the French papers now, but the French papers talking mainly about something happening, well, quarter of the way around the world anyway, Dipti. Lots of headlines today dedicated to Shimon Peres.
That's right. Wars and Peace. That's a headline from the left-leaning paper Libération this morning, Stuart. There's a portrait of Shimon Peres, the Israeli statesman who died yesterday. Now, in its editorial, Libération indeed wonders if he was a man of war or a man of peace. And it turns out he was a bit of both. Of course, he was most famous for being the latter, a man of peace. But Libération reminds readers about his hawkish side. Peres, I quote, was a man of shadows and weapons, one who worked tirelessly to give Israel the means to defend itself and to attack, building the country's first army. At the same time, he understood that for the survival of the Jewish state, the only solution was a, quote, honorable compromise with the Palestinians instead of a, quote, 100-year war. And this was, of course, a position he fought for right to the very end until his death.
And you found a piece in Le Croix, haven't you, which is also focusing on the political paradoxes, if you like, of Peres.
Shimon Peres, a paradoxical destiny. That's what the Catholic paper La Croix says in this obituary piece. The paper also describes Peres in similar words, a political man between war and peace, contradictions that made him a controversial figure of Israeli and regional politics. Now, Le Figaro reminds us that Peres was the architect, really, of the Oslo Accords, which aimed to kickstart the peace process, and it earned him, alongside Yitzhak Rabin and the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, a Nobel Peace Prize. But it was never really achieved in Peres's lifetime, and the idea of a two-state solution, which was a beacon of hope back then, draws, I quote, skepticism and mockery today. That's what Le Figaro says. Now, it's clear that Peres's vision of peace is far from being achieved, as the communist paper L'Humanité says on its front page today. Since the Oslo Accords, peace has been postponed.
Well, from peace in the Middle East to peace now in Colombia. Le Croix is focusing on a referendum that's going to take place in Colombia this weekend on the peace deal, of course, between the government and the FARC that was signed a couple of days ago.
Well, Colombians will be heading to vote in this referendum this Sunday. A vote for peace, that's what La Croix says on its front page. It's dedicated its front page to this vote for peace. Both the government and FARC leaders have signed the peace deal, but La Croix says nothing is set in stone. And in fact, if we look at history, really, it's clear that peace processes have fallen apart at every step at every stage of the process. The paper says even the most promising peace processes have failed, and that sometimes a truce can just be temporary. Case in point, Syria, but also the Central African Republic and even Israel. Now, in its editorial, La Croix reminds us that peace cannot be imposed by force. Reconciliation, I quote, needs perseverance, it needs truth and justice to prevail, and it needs mediators. Now, fortunately, in Colombia's case, it seems that they've sort of organized several of these elements, or they're at least present in the current peace process. So for La Croix, that's at least a promising prospect.
Now, for Le Figaro, Europe is experiencing its own war of sorts.
Well, Europe was really the beacon of hope, really. It was the shining example of the possibility of peace post-war. Yet Europe has never been more divided. According to Le Figaro, the continent is in the midst of a, quote, brutal divorce. That's, of course, as you mentioned, 3 months after the Brexit vote. And that consists of a pure and simple exclusion of the British from the single currency market, a market that they really helped to create. So for Le Figaro, there's this sort of strange war, an Anglo-European war that's taking place. And they warn us that the shock of a Brexit could be brutal, and it could lead to a, quote, pitiless settling of scores between the, quote, continent and the Brits.
Now, here in France, it is back to university for many students, and François Hollande is going to be delivering a speech to students at a Paris university today.
It'll be an occasion for him to evoke his record on youth-related issues, although probably he won't want to, because if you look at his record on youth unemployment, it's not great. The street paper 20 Minutes reminds us that Hollande made the French youth and their issues a priority during the presidential campaign back 5 years ago. Yeah. And yet, youth unemployment in France is still extremely high. It stands at nearly 24% for those between 15 and 24 years of age, so that's 1 in 4. And it's actually higher than in 2011 under Hollande's predecessor, Nicolas Sarkozy. Now, La Croix has actually published a study that shows it's not just about young people. 14% of homeless people between the ages of 30 and 50 have undertaken tertiary studies, and 10% of them actually have diplomas. That's 10% of 140,000 homeless people in France. So it's quite shocking to imagine that somebody you find sitting on the street could actually have a university degree.
OK, we shall see what Francoise Hollande says a little bit later on, I'm sure. Thank you very much, Dipti. Dipti with the papers. She'll be back with the international ones in a couple of hours' time.